Well, firstly, thanks for having us. Yeah, so we're going to share the responsibilities of talking through the slides, thankfully. Otherwise, I think we'd get very tired. But I've got the control of the slides throughout. So any going lack of going too fast or too slow, that's purely my fault. Yeah. Okay. Right. So this is the long list of things that we hope to get through today in the time permitted. So in brief, what we hope to do is to provide an account of, or an interpretation of, anti-exceptionalism about logic in terms of the rejection of traditional properties. So the way that sometimes anti-exceptionalism is spoken about, and when I say anti-exceptionalism, I will just say anti-exceptionalism rather than anti-exceptionalism about logic, just it's easier. Sometimes this is defined purely in terms of some kind of continuity with the sciences, and we have several reasons for thinking that's not a particularly good understanding of what's going on in the debate. Okay. And then what we're going to do is we're going to try and demonstrate the fruitfulness of this particular articulation of anti-exceptionalism by demonstrating that there are two, or describing two different variations, okay, or forms of anti-exceptionalism, which are called metaphysical and epistemological. And that these two forms can be expressed by their rejection of distinct properties of these distinct, some of these properties in the cluster set of traditional properties assigned to logic, and that they have distinct motivations. Okay, so they really do kind of come apart. And not only intuitively can one endorse one of these forms and not the other, we'll actually show this by outlining briefly the position which we endorse, logical predictivism, which is a form of epistemological anti-exceptionalism, and show that it's consistent with various different metaphysical readings of logic. Okay, so we can actually reject some of the epistemological properties, traditional epistemological properties of logic, without rejecting some of the metaphysical. Okay, so let's start with just briefly explain why we're not so happy with the traditional traditional articulation of anti-exceptionalism as it's given in the literature. So thankfully, you know, it's a burgeoning area of inquiry, but people are interested in coming up with anti-exceptionist accounts of logic, but it's not necessarily particularly clear what's going on always. And it's not unusual to find people saying that anti-exceptionalism just is the idea that logic is continuous with the sciences, or perhaps even more regularly, the empirical sciences. And I think undoubtedly here, there's a harking back to the Quine statement that philosophy is continuous, or we can hope that philosophy, the methods of philosophy and its subject matter, will be continuous with the sciences. And we see it, of course, in the people don't often cite the Quine claim directly. They often cite Ole's first paragraph, or mention it from his 2017. Now, some of you have seen talks by me previously where I've gone on length about, I think, the problems with this one paragraph. And to be fair to Ole, he is just trying to sell his own theory, and he's an incredibly good salesman. So he does go on later on to talk in much more detail about how these claims are much more nuanced. But just to give you this paragraph, which I'm sure a lot of you know, and the important part here is the first part: logic isn't special. Its theories are continuous with science. Its methodology continues with the scientific method. Okay, and people often just kind of, I think, take that. And the reason why I just think that this is often what they're citing is because this is literally the paragraph that people often use after they've defined what anti-exceptionalism is. Okay, so we think this is a mistake, though. we think it's a mistake to use this purely as the articulation for several reasons. The first reason is it just leaves too much unsaid. Okay, so the Ole's quote says that the theories are continuous and that the method is continuous. But the problem here is that to talk about theories being continuous and methods being continuous, firstly, those two things can come apart quite easily. Okay, but secondly, even talking about the notion of method being continuous is just lacks a necessary nuance. Does this mean that the types of evidence appealed to are the same, okay, or similar in some sense? Maybe they're a posteriori in some cases. Maybe that's an element of similarity, okay? Or does it mean that the methods are similar in the sense that explanation plays a role, or the prediction plays a role? Because what's interesting is that people that are often cited as being anti-exceptionalists, they don't necessarily think that logic plays an explanatory role, and they certainly, I think, apart from us, don't actually propose a model in which prediction plays a significant role in the notion of theory choice, right? Although this undoubtedly plays a role when it comes to the sciences. So there's a lack of nuance here. So it's not very helpful, okay, as an account to explain the content of anti-exceptionalism by just saying there's continuity with the sciences. Secondly, if we would take the strongest possible interpretation of this, where the subject matter of logic were continuous to the sciences, the method were, the types of evidence were, okay, even down to the nature of data collection, then we'd have a situation where we literally have naturalism about logic. Okay, so you would have the kind of traditional Quinean picture. But the problem here is that, as we've written about elsewhere, it isn't the case that lots of people who are considered to be anti-exceptionalists are naturalists when it comes to logic. The fact that people appeal to things such as mathematical objects sometimes, or mathematical results, or they appeal to logico-semantic paradoxes more generally. These are not the kind of approaches necessary to expect if there were continuity in all regards with the empirical sciences. Okay, so again, we don't have a nuance of picture. And to really to bang that point home, there are clearly cases in the methodological principles or procedures which are carried out in the empirical sciences, or some areas of the empirical sciences, which are not carried out, performed in logic we don't care about. For example, chemists are very interested in measuring, in increasing levels of precision constants in nature. Okay, logicians don't seem to be engaged in that process whatsoever. Okay, so it's much more important that we pick out the areas of purported continuity if we are going to be interested in the notion of there being a relationship between the sciences and between logic. But I think the biggest point here is that if we just define up front anti-exceptionalism as the idea there's a continuity with logic and the sciences, is we miss the historical historical points of clashing points between anti-exceptionalists and exceptionalists when it comes to debating about the content, the subject matter of logic or its methodology. The individuals that are often cited as being anti-exceptionalists are not just interested in suggesting, or not primarily interested in suggesting there's a similarity between logic and the sciences. Okay, what they're actually often interested in doing is providing upfront an account of logic's nature and showing that or of its methodology, and showing that that methodology or that nature is contrary to how, traditionally speaking, logic has been considered. Okay, traditionally been considered. So one of the bonuses of getting away from this idea that we ought to just say, look, if your position is anti-exceptionist one, it ought to be evaluated on the basis of how closely it ties logic to the sciences. If we get away from that, then we get away from the concern of that we find with some authors such as De Costa and Arahart, who want to say, well, if you're not going to engage, if you're not going to embrace every element of science, so you haven't got a fully blown anti-exceptionalist picture. Okay, and I think that thinking in terms of these gradations of anti-exceptionalism is a mistake, because it fails to appreciate that the motivations for embracing different elements of anti-exceptionalism are very distinct. So how then should we go about understanding why the notion of continuity with the sciences? Well, we think it's much more fruitful to think about anti-exceptionalism in terms of the rejection of traditional properties. That when we see, for example, people such as Maddie and Cher arguing for their particular account of the subject matter of, and these are the clearest cases I think of this, arguing for their particular example, their particular theory of subject matter of logic, and then potentially how it's justified. What they want to say is that we're mistaken in proposing that logic has some of the traditional properties it does. And these traditional properties actually end up getting in the way of a much more nuanced or accurate picture of how logic functions. So what we're going to do now is briefly outline some of these properties and the role that they've played in the articulation of logic. And then we'll go on to talk about how different versions of anti-exceptionalism can come about through the rejection of these properties. There are many more properties than we've got time to talk about in detail today. Here are a list of just some of them. You already have an intuitive idea, I'm sure, of many of these. I'm going to talk just about the first 5 today. So generality, formality, the foundational nature of logical evidence, a priority, and its analysticity. There's a lot more to say than we've got time to today, obviously, but just give a quick overview and the import that are often given to these properties when it comes to the articulation of logic as a subject matter or an area of inquiry. So firstly, generality. Now, generality may be the most important when it comes to the traditional articulation of logic. Some, such as Frege, seem to use generality as the defining feature of logic. Okay, so it's the most general laws of thought. Okay, and you also see this in some modern articulations of logic. So J.C. Bill defines logic as the study of the correct universal closure relation for all theories. So that means that if there is a theory that doesn't abide by these rules, by definition, these rules can't be logical. You might have some rules, some interesting relations, some interesting closure relations, or some interesting rules which pertain to a subset of these theories, but they then wouldn't be logical rules or laws. They would be science specific laws or rules. Okay. So the point is that logical rules hold for all propositions, regardless of their content, regardless of their subject matter, unlike other laws such as those of the distinct sciences. Okay. Now, what's interesting, of course, about this generality is if these rules do hold regardless of subject matter, okay, they're not domain specific, that means they're not going to be about any particular objects. Okay, they're not going to be about any particular objects, and this has led to philosophers traditionally saying that therefore that means that logical rules can't be concerned with the content of propositions, right? Given the content given either by the meaning of whether it be the objects or the subjects, but have to be somehow about their form. Now, as we know from Macfarlane's excellent doctoral thesis, there are multiple interpretations of what form means here. One interpretation of form is just generality, right? So obviously that isn't what we're talking about when we say that in virtue of the generality of logic, we also say that logic is formal, but there are 2 other interpretations that are often given here. Right? One is the idea that there is no semantic content whatsoever to logical laws, and this is the position that's often taken by, we can interpret Kant has taken, the idea that logic provides a formal framework under which our thoughts can be organized in the same way as in which the transcendental frameworks provide us also with something when it comes to experience of the world. So the logical framework provides that for our thoughts, our judgments. And a view such as this also seems to be in the early Carnap and the early Wittgenstein. We find this kind of situation going here, that logic is a syntax contentless, but a syntax through which we can understand things through. Okay, but of course, lots of contemporary logicians understand formality in terms of permutation invariance. Okay, and actually some of these logicians, interestingly, invert the justification relation between generality and formality, so that they actually think this is, and Guy Lecher is the nice example of this, they actually tried to explain the generality of logic in terms of its formality, not the formality of logic in terms of its generality. Now, I won't talk today about what impact that actually has in terms of your resulting notion of logic, but it can have an impact if you start off with the stipulation that logic is about formality, not say about generality. You can get actually a slightly different picture about what your logical laws are going to look like. Very interesting question, but something we haven't got time to talk about today. So that's generality and formality. Now let's talk a little bit about some of the epistemic upshots potentially of this, the generality and formality as traditionally considered of logic. So one of the things you might think is interesting about logic's generality is that if these laws hold to the fullest possible extent, that means that we can't use results from other areas of inquiry without presupposing a logical rule. Okay, because we've already used logic to its full generality in the engagement of justifying other theories. Okay, that's the general proposal. So that means that in some sense, epistemically speaking, logic must be foundational, in a sense that other inquiries are not. And this doesn't just hold for the empirical, for the empirical sciences, it also holds for the mathematical sciences. So we appeal to rules of inference, logical rules of inference, in order to prove theorems. Okay, not always the same rules of inference, right? Depends what kind of structures we're interested in, mathematical structures we're interested in, but we still engage in this kind of, we still appeal to certain rules of inference to prove our results. Now, this foundational nature, justificatory nature of logic isn't often explicitly stated, although we do find some instances of it. For example, Gödel is quite clear when he's talking about Russell's mathematical philosophy. He says, logic is the foundation of all our mathematical study. But it's often implicit, such as with Frege's logicism, when he says that mathematical, and this is one interpretation of Frege, but quite a prominent one. Frege talks about how certain mathematical truths are not self-evident to us, and therefore we have to demonstrate their truth through proofs. But of course, the point starts that there has to be some level of self-evidence, and the idea is that self-evidence is given to the logical rules, because something becomes analytic in virtue of being defined or resulting from the logical rules, right? So the base finishes at these certain primitive logical rules, whatever they are, assuming it's a subset of not all of the logical rules. And we also find it in Hack's discussion, justification of deduction. How do we justify deductive inferences? Well, it can't be anything other than deduction itself, because deduction is not only the strongest, but also anything else would end up presupposing the rules of inference themselves. Okay, so we find this foundational element of logic justification. And one further upshot of the purported foundational element of logic's justification is its a priority. Because if logic is foundational, then it's not going to be possible for us to appeal to other empirical evidence to justify logic. Now, this is because we take ourselves to not be able to directly observe a state of affairs which justifies a rule of inference or a logical law. So that meant that if we were going to try and justify a rule of inference or logical law using empirical evidence, it would have to be somehow drawing consequences from particular observables. We don't just see directly. So some kind of inference is going to occur. And of course, if inference is occurring, then we think that we're having to presuppose, again, certain logical principles. So it can't be that justification comes from these observables, because we end up having to argue, therefore, in a circular manner, right? We end up begging the question when it comes to the truth or validity of certain rules or principles. So that means that if we're going to have some justification for our logical principles, it's going to have to be a priori. Now, as we've written elsewhere, when you combine foundationalism and a priorism, you get these two traditional pictures of how logic can be justified, what we've called logical rationalism and logical semanticism. So the idea is that if logical evidence has to be foundational, so that it can't be mediated through anything else, and it can't be a posteriori, you've got basically two options, it seems. One is you can appeal to something like rational insight. You can say we just have some direct grasp of logical truths or the validity of rules of inference, and this is often tied with a particular metaphysical picture of logical objects existing in some kind of third realm, some kind of mathematical logical Platonism. Or you can have something like Semanticism, which suggests that you can appreciate that a law is true or a rule of inference is valid in virtue of appropriately understanding the content of the rule or the law. And this is often otherwise known as epistemic analysticity, and is often connected with metaphysical analysticity, conventionalism. Okay, so there is a relationship here undoubtedly between the epistemology and the metaphysics, something we'll talk about later. So lastly, on that final point, talking about semanticism, because this obviously was very popular when it came to the mid 20th century, that this combination of foundationalism and a priority bred an additional property for these individuals, namely the analyticity of logic. And of course, analyticity was very important for the positivists because it allowed them to do two things. It allowed to accommodate the epistemological side and the metaphysical side. So because they were skeptical about the existence of a rational insight faculty, but also they wanted to accommodate the purported necessity of logical laws without having to appeal to its metaphysical necessity, they could say, well, I come to know logical truths or the validity of rules of inference not through a special cognitive faculty, but just through my appreciation of linguistic rules, whether that be explicit stipulations or implicit stipulations. Probably implicit stipulations are a better account of what's going on here. And also that means that I have to provide a metaphysical account of why I can have a grasp of meaning. It's because they're conventions, right? So you've got this double-sided element of analyticity of the epistemological side and the metaphysical side. Now, as it's been kind of implicit in my presentation, the epistemological side is often considered historically a consequence of the metaphysical, although, of course, now there are some who want to say that we can have epistemological analyticity without necessarily metaphysical. But really, we can see again, at least in the 20th century, analyticity as being a consequence of the foundational status of logic, and also its a priority. So we could bore you some more about the history of these properties and also the connections between them. I think there's a lot of interesting stuff to be said there. But what we want to concentrate now really is how we can fruitfully understand anti-exceptionalism in terms of the rejection of some of these traditional properties, and how different forms of anti-exceptionalism flow out of the rejection of these versions, out of these traditional properties. So I'll now hand over to Ole, who's going to talk about varieties of anti-exceptionalism.
Thank you, Ben. Can everyone hear me? Thumbs up. Excellent. Okay, next slide, Ben. Yeah, so so what Ben has suggested is that we're trying to think about anti-exceptionalism in terms of some of these purported special properties that logic and logical theorizing has, and that separates it from scientific theorizing, broadly speaking. That's not to say that we think, for example, that merely rejecting one of these properties makes you an anti-exceptionalist, but it seems to be clearly a symptom of anti-exceptionalist theories that they do reject at least some of these properties, and in some cases, most or all of them. But one of the things that we've become aware of in developing our own theory is that, well, some of the properties that we originally, or at least I originally thought had to go within the anti-exceptionalist program is in fact just totally fine, or at least compatible with where we want to go. And that's led us to this distinction that we think is important to keep in mind when discussing anti-exceptionalist proposals, which is a distinction between metaphysical and epistemological variants of anti-exceptionalism. So that's what we want to go on to say a little bit about. Do you want to jump forward then? So, in fact, even though we've talked about metaphysical properties of logic, and certainly people have written about the metaphysics of logic in the past, many of the contributions to the anti-exceptionalist literature, at least in recent years, they have focused really on epistemological matters, right? So how do you get logical knowledge? How do you select a logical theory? How do you compare logical theories, typically by abductivist methods? And they've gone into details. My own papers are, just examples of this. They've gone into details about some of the selection criteria that you might entertain, and so on and so forth. But very little has been said about the nature or the subject matter of the logical theories, right? And that's a little bit tricky because people don't always agree about what the subject matter of logic is. And I think what we're trying to do now is just to give you a little bit of a taste about the sort of various directions that you could take and how that will influence your thinking about these quote unquote special properties and therefore the anti-exceptionalist programs. So when we're talking about the subject matter of logical theories, one interesting question is, in virtue of what, if anything, are claims about validity and consistency and other logical claims you might be interested in true? So, for example, are there logical facts that make these claims true? And if so, what is the nature of the logical facts? And clearly, lots of philosophers of logic differ on this, and in fact, they differ quite dramatically. Can you move forward, Ben? So, just sort of straight off the bat, you could be a sort of exceptionalist in a quite radical sense, metaphysical exceptionalist to quite a radical sense, if you just reject the idea that there are logical facts at all. You reject that logical claims are in the business of being true or false. So if I say that modus ponens is valid, I'm not actually saying anything that can be taken as true or false. And there are non-cognitivists or non-factualists like this in the literature. So Hartree-Field has written about this on a couple of occasions. Resnick has as well. And on these pictures, they're sort of, it seems reasonable to call them exceptionalists because metaphysically speaking, they differ a lot from the cognitivist view of most sciences that is commonly held. So clearly, logic is quite separate, and it's perhaps better compared to, for example, ethics, where some non-cognitive views have had some popularity, right? Think about expressivism, quasi-realism, and so on, right? And now there are expressivist accounts of logic out there as well. Thank you, Ben. That was pretty brutal. You just went for it. Okay, but even if you're a cognitivist and you think, yes, there are in fact logical facts underpinning these claims, though the nature of those facts could be radically different from the sorts of facts that the sciences trade in. And one example is normativism, right? So you think there are facts, but you think that these facts are normative facts, right? So this is different from the idea that the logical theory is, for instance, just a set of recommendations, right, for how to think, but it's true claims about how we ought to infer or ought to believe. And again, it sort of smacks of exceptionalism, right? Because, well, those are the kind of facts that, they're very different from the facts of physics or chemistry or even economics or psychology. So logic is set apart on this metaphysical dimension. And here, clearly, you're in the business of preserving, say, the property of normativity that we spoke about previously. Okay, next slide, Ben. Thank you. But then in contrast, take a view like psychologism about logic, right? And this goes back at least to John Stuart Mill's work on logic. So it kind of, it's a bit difficult to attribute this to Mill because that's kind of controversial, but at least on a sort of naive picture, psychologism just says that the logic is in the business of giving descriptive claims about human psychology, about our reasoning modules and dispositions to reason, and so on and so forth. And this is a kind of metaphysics of logic on which you're clearly moving in an anti-exceptionalist rejection, right? So now the subject matter of logic is safely within the bounds of empirical science. The logical truths are presumably contingent truths, right? The truths about our psychology. The justifications of these theories are going to include a posteriori evidence, say experimental psychology. And I don't think logic would be topic neutral, at least not directly, right? I mean, it trades in something specific. But then, of course, we know that on that sort of unsophisticated picture, there are kind of well-known objections, right? So Frege's anti-psychologism at the time, sort of brought psychologism out of favor, and one of the things that Frege is pressing is that it confuses the justification of a logical law with the psychological explanation of our belief in it. And to be fair, someone like Mill was aware of this and tried to reconcile these aspects of logic, but I'll set that aside. But anyway, it's very clear that there's a major difference in how you think about the so-called special properties. So then in Frege's reaction, which is, of course, which sets the stage for most of thinking about logic in the 20th century, he wants to insist that as opposed to being sort of empirical psychological facts about logic and also mathematics are mind-independent facts. And in fact, this is the motivation in part for introducing the so-called third realm, on which the facts of logic and mathematics are non-spatial temporal, they're causally inert, and so on and so forth. And again, I mean, I think it's fair to say that this is kind of a metaphysical exceptionalism, right? I mean, you want to preserve the objectivity of logic, but you do that at the cost of sort of introducing something that is by definition set apart from the subject matter of the sciences. And then, of course, the virtue, at least by Frege's light, is that you use this as a framework to keep to establish the properties, necessity, a priority, the foundational nature of logical laws, and so on. So this is where we're kind of starting to point towards the more contemporary discussions of the metaphysics of logic, because I think many philosophers of logic, those interested in the nature of logical facts, would agree with Frege that they want some kind of objectivity in logic. But many of us would be a little bit worried about the kind of connection that we can have with these so-called third realm facts, right? And the manifestation of this in mathematics is very famous as the Field-Benacerraf problem, right, in various formulations. But that same problem has, of course, been formulated also for logic more directly. And it is, part of the motivation for moving to a metaphysics of logic that is not as far removed from the sciences that we'll get to very soon. So in a sense, we want to look at two ways in which you can try to make the epistemology connected to these logical facts a little bit less mysterious. And so the first one, this is so smooth, Ben. You're really good at it. It's all on cue here. I'm trying to go reasonably fast. The first one is conventionalism, right? So you might say, well, there are no third round facts of logic. In fact, it's realism, or at least a type of realism, that has to go overboard. Instead, we think of the facts of logic as being facts of language, or conceptual facts, or something like that, ultimately grounded in conventions. And this is a picture that's sort of familiar from logical positivism. At least some of the philosophers in the tradition, like Ayer and Hahn, formulated something along these lines, and perhaps Carnap as well, although it's a little bit harder to place Carnap in the developments in his philosophy. Now, in this picture, where we can say that something logical laws are something like true in virtue of meaning, or at least the meaning of the involved logical expressions, there is sort of a case to be made that we can argue for not only the metaphysical analyticity of logical laws, or in Arthur Pryor's phrase, that some arguments are analytically valid, but also that they are necessary. Although now the notion of necessity is supposed to be reduced to something less mysterious than metaphysical necessity. And ultimately, and this is important, that the laws are a priori knowable, for example, because they're epistemically analytic, and Ben already talked about this. But for our purposes, it's important to stress that the metaphysical theory of conventionalism is different from the epistemological theory that buys into something like epistemic analyticity, right? So it's going to be important for us to keep those apart later on. And here again, I'm just going to mention before I move on that it's pretty clear that those facts, I mean, the conventional facts, which you might be an anti-realist about, right, are again quite different from the sorts of facts that we think that the sciences trade in. Yeah, just move on, but yeah. And then finally, if you take your cue from Frege again, and you want to preserve the objectivity of logic, but you want to tell some sort of more straightforward epistemological story, you might start with a famous quote by Russell, which a lot of people have used as sort of tagline for their own philosophies. Namely, logic is concerned with the real world just as truly as zoology, though with its more abstract and general features. And so this is a view that Ben and I, following Ricketts, call universalism, or the universalist conception of logic. And the idea here is that, a little bit too quickly now, Ben. Can you? I wasn't allowed to read that.
Sorry, I think you wanted the quote. Do you know when the Ricketts quote?
I wasn't not quite, but okay.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah. Thank you. So the idea now is that the logical laws really are about the actual world, but they're about very general properties of the world, right? So the thinking now for the anti-exceptionalist is simply that, well, look, it's just more science, right? It's just that the laws are kind of unrestricted generalizations, right, to of some sort. And you do away with the third realm problem of introducing some specific metaphysical entities, properties, and objects for logic. Okay, hit me with the quote. Under universalist conception of logic, the logical laws that mediate demonstrative inference are maximally general truths. That is, they are laws that generalize over all objects, properties, and relations, and their formulation requires only the topic universal vocabulary needed to make statements on any topic whatsoever. For example, sign for conjunction and negation, as well as quantifiers to express generality. On the universalist view, then, logic is thus a science in its own right, one that is directed at reality in the same way that physics is, but a reality's more general features. And the context here is that Ricketts is talking about Wittgenstein's criticism, really, of this universalist conception. And in fact, in a very nice paragraph in the Philosophical Investigation, I think Wittgenstein calls it ultra physics. Ultra physics is the sort of the physics of these very general features. That's meant to be a joke, I guess. So a lot of people have followed this line of thinking and they take it seriously, right? Even though even if Wittgenstein didn't. So here's Penny Maddy on a paper on naturalism and logic. This brand of realism, logic reflects objective truths about the world, but without many of the features that typically accompany such realism. Logical truth is necessary, but contingent on the presence of the requisite structures. Logic doesn't describe a world of abstracta, but our own familiar physical world. And Gila Scher, in her recent book, Epistemic Friction, I believe it's called, isn't that right, Ben? This leads to a view that, like Platonism, affirms the reality of abstract features, and like nominalism, has no need for a second reality. The reason for the latter is that the abstract features we have observed are features of objects and properties residing right here in our world, and they hold of these objects' properties right here as well, rather than in some other reality. So the way I think about this is that this is a sort of a fairly pure metaphysical anti-exceptionalism, right? Where you give up at least potentially give up necessity, right? Although some of the contributors disagree about this, you give up the a priority of logic, and in some sense you give up the topic neutrality, right? Logic is about our world; it's just about these very general features, and the sort of distinguishing mark of this metaphysical thinking is that logic is by definition general or universal, right? That's built into the idea, right? It's not a law of logic unless it is a absolutely general law of this sort. And I should mention also that this is probably also fairly similar to Tim Williamson's view about logic, where logical laws are unrestricted generalizations for him, formulated in some higher order language. Okay, Ben.
Great, thanks. So the whole point with this particular form, the metaphysical form of anti-exceptionalism, is that it's motivated very much by the idea that we don't want logic to be about something which somehow alienates ourselves from it. Okay. So in its most modern form, this is universalism, the idea that logic is about the world in the same ways in which other scientific theories are about the world, but in just a more general regard. This actually harks back very much to some of the medieval traditions where logic and metaphysics were very closely connected. But the idea here is that you reject formality in the kind of Kantian sense, where logical laws have no content. I mean, they have content because they're about the structures of the world. And as Ole said, they also emphasize the generality of logic, but reject also the normativity of logic in the sense that there's something normatively primitive about logic. Like, it might be that logical theories provide you with some ought claims, but fundamentally logic is about the world, about non-normative facts. That doesn't mean, like Frege said, all correct theories can provide you with some oughts, but that's because they're in virtue of being true. What I want to talk about now is a different version of anti-exceptionalism, which has different motivations. It's not an attempt to in a sense to not alienate ourselves from logic as something which is totally apart, something which investigate. Really, epistemological anti-exceptionalism is the fundamental idea that when we're choosing theories of logic, we go about it in a similar fashion to how we choose theories in the sciences more generally. And epistemological anti-exceptionalism is actually it comprises two distinct elements here, really. The first is the methodological part, which says that just the process of theory choice is the same. So that means whatever the mechanism we tend to use when it comes to theory choice within the sciences or other areas of social sciences, natural sciences, whatever that process is, then we use a similar process as it occurs. We use a similar process in logic. But there's a second component, which is really about the nature, in effect, of the evidence or data which is used within that mechanism. The second element, evidential anti-exceptionalism, says that in addition to the mechanism being the same, the type of evidence used within that mechanism, or the type of data used in that mechanism, is also unexceptional. Okay, it's not unusual. So someone might say there that the type of evidence. Apologise if you can hear some works going on in the background. In this position, you could say that the type of evidence you're using is exceptional, but the mechanism by which you use that evidence to actually choose your theory is not exceptional. So a nice example here is Bertrand Russell, who says that although he's making a normative claim about the way that logic and philosophy ought to go about its business, not actually a factual claim, but he's saying that we ought to engage in philosophy and logic in the same way as we engage in the sciences by something like broadly like abduction. But he admits that the type of evidence appealed to in this abductive process would be wholly a priori. There would be judgments, okay, a priori judgments, intuitions. So there's a case of someone who would be a methodological anti-exceptionalist, but an evidential exceptionalist. And going back to naturalism, of course, if someone was a naturalist, they would endorse both the methodological and the evidential, but you don't need to endorse both. Okay, you don't need to endorse both of these. And going forward, we're going to be talking much more in depth about methodological anti-exceptionalism, because one of the concerns that Ole and I have when it comes to evidential anti-exceptionalism is that each science actually has its own form of evidence that it appeals to. Even if methodologically speaking at base, they use the same kind of mechanism of theory choice or similar, the types of evidence each of the sciences appeals to is actually very distinctive. So in the literature so far, when people have been speaking of methodological anti-exceptionalism, that is the mechanism of theory choice in logic, they often presume that this has to be an abductive method. Okay, now, we think that this is mistaken, but this is the starting point for this position. What do we mean by abductive method? Well, the abductive method basically says that you don't have direct access to the claims within a logic, such as that the law excluded middle every instance of the law excluding middle is true. What you actually have access to, or you try to justify initially, is the theory as a whole, and then it's a form of holism in this sense, and then you justify each proposition in virtue of justifying the whole theory. So you select the theory, you select for the theory on the basis of evidence, and then you commit yourself to the propositions, the claims within the theory. Okay. Now, how do you justify the theory? Well, you justify the theory because it better accommodates certain relevant data. Okay. And people in the literature disagree on exactly what this data is, and in fact, in some cases, it's very, very unclear what the data is. And of course, as you would expect, if you're just fitting the data to the theory, or the theory to the data, you're going to get cases of underdetermination, and therefore you have to appeal to additional virtues, okay, to help you select the correct theory, or the best theory given this data. These includes, again, there's lots of disagreement on what these virtues would be, but they include things such as expressive power, simplicity, unifying power, and non-ad hocness. Okay. One of the points I want to make here is that, firstly, it's important to recognize here that methodological anti-exceptionalism is not the same as the abductive method. Okay, you could admit that as we're going to propose later, that the method, the mechanism of theory choice in logic is the same as you get in the sciences. Okay, but actually, similar sciences, but actually isn't that of abduction. Okay, so now we're going to get onto a process of trying to explain how you could be an epistemological anti-exceptionalist without necessarily being a metaphysical. And this is very much about the motivation that underpins being an epistemological anti-exceptionalist. So if like us, your anti-exceptionalism, your epistemological anti-exceptionalism is motivated by trying to work out how logicians actually choose between their theories, and you have a model led by the practice, and it leads you to endorsing a version of epistemological anti-exceptionalism. That doesn't mean that therefore necessarily you're going to buy into one of the metaphysical pictures which was offered up previously, and that's something we want to go about showing now. So these two forms of anti-exceptionalism can come apart. So we're going to just briefly explain what logical predictivism suggests. We're not going to have anywhere near enough time to go into detail about what it proposes in full generality. Logical predictivism at its core suggests that the method by which logicians choose their theories when it comes to providing an account of validity, the way they choose the logics on the basis of the logics being predictively successful, and the data which they're trying to predict include things such as the steps within an informal mathematical proof which mathematicians find acceptable. And when it comes to vernacular arguments, it's instances of forms of arguments which individuals find acceptable, whoever those individuals are. That's an interesting question. That these logics provide fruitful explanations of why particular vernacular arguments are valid and why others are invalid. And also other forms of evidence are involved here, such as demonstrating that your particular logical theory is compatible with other well-evidenced commitments. And these include things such as linguistic facts about our natural languages, such as semantic closure. Okay. So what we're going to do now is just give a brief overview of what predictivism says. The first thing to say is just to clarify what we mean by logical theories. So when we say a logical theory, we don't just mean a logical system. We mean, in effect, the logical system plus lots of the stuff that's going on in the background, some of the philosophical elements which fill in really the components, the other components which allow for the evaluation of vernacular arguments. This includes the particular account of what consequence is, so understanding consequence in terms of either truth preservation or some kind of proof theoretic account. For example, you have two individuals who agree that classical logic is correct. Well, one endorses a proof theoretic and the other one endorses a model theoretic. Okay, and of course there's game theoretic options as well. So, but it will also include claims such as whether bivalence holds. Yeah, and it will also include rules for translating your formalism into the natural language. So let tilde stand for some instances of not. Okay, and there's lots of context involved here. It's a tricky matter when it comes to translation, as you know, but it's in elements like that are going to be included in the theory. Okay, we're not trying to provide a conclusive account of everything that's collected in the theory. In the paper, we give a breakdown of the kind of content we'd expect to occur in a theory, but it's more about the idea that it's not just the formalism. If you're going to have a logical theory providing an explanation of why certain arguments are valid, it can't just be the formalism, it has to be additional content. Okay, that's how you get the explanation, as we'll see in a second. Good. So how do we make sense of what's going on then in the Predictivist picture? What's really going on when we say that logical theories are trying to explain explain the validity of certain arguments and how they engaged in prediction? So what we try to do often is start with the mathematical cases, because it's quite uncontentious that philosophers at the end of at the beginning of the 20th century and the end of the 19th century were interested in providing accounts of logics which could, in some sense, account for steps within mathematical proofs, okay, and could sometimes deliver the results of those. And this is true of Frege and Russell, but also true of Gensen with the providing a proof theoretic account. So what's not beyond doubt is that classical logic provides quite an accessible story of the validity of these proofs, because it was constructed exactly for that purpose, right? So what the predictivist story says when it comes to this is that what's being explained, okay, the logical theory when it comes to mathematical proofs is trying to explain exactly why certain steps, certain more general steps within a mathematical proof are valid. Okay, it's trying to explain exactly why they're valid, not just to categorize them appropriately as valid or invalid, but say why they're valid. Okay, and it does that by saying, for example, well, they're truth preserving, and these particular instances are truth preserving just because of the form of the proposition, because it contains, for example, the conditional in just this fashion, okay, or the fact that it's an instance of modus ponens, and modus ponens is valid because it's of this particular form, okay, and then an explanation of what the form is and exactly how those go together, okay. So the idea is that the laws which are in the logical theory, in a sense, underwrite, and this is not just that they don't. It's not just the generalizations that explain, right? So the generalization of all instances of modus ponens are valid, that's not the explanation. What you then need to go into is the components of why modus ponens is valid, and that will be a combination of the account of consequence and also the account of how the conditional functions, for example. Okay. Now the question is that how does it, that's the explanation, but how does it support the theory? Well, it supports the theory by making predictions. Okay. It says, for example, if this theory is correct, then it's going to predict that the instances of these particular laws are going to be found to be acceptable by mathematicians. Okay. So then you, in effect, go out into the world, you look at instances of proofs which are found acceptable by mathematicians, and you say, well, my theory predicts that these are going to be found acceptable and these are going to be found unacceptable. And then if it aligns with that, you go, good, thumbs up, right? the theory when it comes to those regards, in that regard, is evidenced. Okay, and then if you've got multiple theories which accord with that particular data, then you have to make further predictions based upon the postulates of the theory, and then you'll get further predictions out. Okay, and these predictions can be drawn out of the meaning given to the connectives and the meaning given to the consequence relation within the theory. We'll give an example of this in a moment. But note that it's not just, we don't just interested in the predictions when it comes to mathematical theories. We're also interested in the predictions made about more general, more about validity more generally. Okay, so it's not just about the steps made in mathematical proofs. It's also about which arguments are valid in our vernacular language anyway, right? Validity to core, not just validity in mathematics. So this means that we can't just rely upon the mathematician's judgments about what's a valid step within an informal proof. We also need to be looking at what's considered to be acceptable within moves when it comes to argumentative steps more generally. Now, this causes a slight problem because we often think that we can appeal to mathematicians' judgments when it comes to proofs, but we often think that individuals on the street are unreliable when it comes to evaluating whether an argument is good or not, right? Acceptable, whether A follows from B. Okay, but what we think is that if you actually look at logical practice, what logicians do tend to do is still appeal to instances and whether their intuitions, whether this be their linguistic intuitions or something else, whether about whether this argument is a good one or not. Those inform seemingly our logical theories. Okay, so what, generally speaking, and Ole's going to go into detail about an example of this in a second, what we generally think that the logics are trying to do here is they're trying to explain again why certain argumentative steps are valid, not in this case just mathematical steps in informal proofs, but just argument steps more generally, and that the validity of these steps are underwritten by the rules within the logical theory. Again, this is not just generalizations such as all instances of modus ponens are true, but things such as validity is explained in terms of truth preservation and the behavior of the connectives given like such. And how do you judge the correctness of this logical theory? Well, again, you have to go out and look at how people judge the acceptability of instances of arguments which your theory either predicts are going to turn out to be valid or invalid, and you take those judgments to be reliable indications of either the validity or the invalidity of the arguments. Okay, now this is at the moment quite theoretical, so what we're going to do is just give you an example quickly of how this works.
Ben, I think given that we're running very short on time, I think we should just leave the example for now, go to the final slides, and then we can return to the example in the Q&A if we need to. Yeah.
Okay. Do you want to? I'm going to drive. Do you want to explain the consequences of the?
No, you can just go ahead.
I'll just go ahead. Okay. So we're taking the given that everyone knows then what how predictivism works. Leave us have a short time. So we're just going to briefly say why we think epistemological and metaphysical anti-exceptionalism kind of come apart then. And this is based on the view that predictivism seems to be compatible with multiple of the accounts that Ole mapped out when it comes to a metaphysical stance on logic. And we're just going to concentrate, just look here now at psychologism, normativism, conventionalism, and universalism. Actually, I think we'll just look here at conventionalism and psychologism, okay, and just briefly say why particularly we think that it's compatible with both of them. Okay, so here's all four. So the mechanism, predictivism is very much about the mechanism by which you choose a theory. So whether you can successfully predict certain data as being therefore then in the future compatible or incompatible with a theory, right? It has some postulates, and then you draw out consequences, and you test on basis of external data. Now, which of these particular metaphysical accounts you're going to sign up to if you're a predictivist will depend on the data. And in some cases, what that data isn't very clear. So if you're a psychologistic logician, you're going to think that the data is very much about which inferences are accepted, okay, by the community, okay. But note how similar this is to the conventionalist picture, which is that it's about linguistic intuitions, okay, about which, given the rules that we have, which particular moves in the linguistic game we're generally going to find acceptable. But note how similar also this is to the normativist picture, which says that the initial data is about how you ought to infer, okay? These are normative facts about what's right and what's wrong to infer. But on a standard account of when you're asking people, well, is this acceptable or unacceptable? And similarly for a mathematician, it's very hard to separate these distinct claims about this is just how people tend to infer psychologism, and this is how you ought to infer, okay? Because people just tend to presume that the way that they're inferring is how they ought to infer. So it's very hard when you're talking about data to disconnect these two things. And lastly, when it comes to universalism, this is quite unclear because universalists aren't always upfront about the process of supporting their theories. But if you were a universalist and you thought, just like someone like Bill seems to think, J.C. Bill seems to think that logic's about the universal closure of a theory, and that's very similar to a universalist here. That what you ought to actually look at is scientific theories and the rules of inference which people appeal to, scientists appeal to, in telling their story about the world. But note again how similar it is to the others, in the sense that the only distinct element here is that you're concentrating on particular reliable reasoners, namely scientists, right? Those who can tell us something about the fundamental structure of the world. So you're looking at the rules of inference they tend to appeal to. But it's just very, very similar as it could be that, of course, the reason why they appeal to these rules is just because they are just the conventions which we tend, that our linguistic rules insist that we use, right? Or happens to be used. So it seems like predictivism is consistent with all four of these pictures, and it's very hard actually to make sense of what that data is, which of these four metaphysical pictures that data tells the story of. And lastly, it matters which these metaphysical pictures comes out on top when it comes to certain of the traditional properties. So undoubtedly, predictivism requires you to reject certain epistemic properties, namely its logic's foundationalism, its a priority, okay, and also its epistemic analysticity. We don't just come to know the truth of a logical claim in virtue of understanding it. We have to go through a process of predicting that certain judgments will be, that certain arguments will be found to be acceptable, certain arguments will be found to be unacceptable. We don't just have direct access, we have to actually go through a process of confirmation, disconfirmation. However, we could accept the predictivist picture while still accepting some form of metaphysical analyticity. If we were conventionalist, we could accept that although we don't have direct access to these truths, that actually underneath these logical claims is a form of metaphysical analyticity, that what establishes their validity or their truth is their meaning. They are conventions, okay? But if psychologism were correct, that of course wouldn't be the case. It wouldn't be the meaning of them. It would just be just pure the way that people, because their cognitive faculties tend to infer. Okay, human beings tend to infer. Further, we wouldn't necessarily, if it were psychologism were true, of course, we would be rejecting necessity completely as well, which wouldn't necessarily be the case if it was conventionalism, because as far as conventionalists are concerned, within that linguistic framework, the conclusions are necessary. Whereas as far as psychologism is the case, that we could just have different psychological rules that we follow. So the point here is that psychologism, predictivism is seemingly consistent with different metaphysical pictures about how logic functions, and because of that, it's consistent either with the rejection of certain of these metaphysical properties of logic, but also keeping them. Okay, so it seems that then metaphysical exceptionalism and epistemological exceptionalism can come apart. You can be a epistemological anti-exceptionalist while still holding on to lots of the traditional metaphysical properties of logic, such as necessity, its generality, and its metaphysical analysticity. Right, that's it for a very long talk. Thank you very much.